wanted to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, to what is really quite a landmark event, not just for the New Culture Forum, but I think for the cultural life of the country. The New Culture Forum's first literary festival. And that's really something. Next year, I would say as well, we are going to be celebrating the NCF's 20th anniversary. That's worth a round of applause, I think. The reason I mention this is quite simple, is that I started the New Culture Forum back in 2006, so that's, getting on 20 years ago. And at that time, the sort of issues that we, on the whole, talk about virtually exclusively now were still relatively peripheral. But there was one thing that I remember that really stood out in my mind at that time. The same year as that, the then director of the National Theatre, Sir Nicholas Heitner, I remember he gave an interview and he said, what we really need are a few, and this is a quote, a good few mischievous right-wing plays at the National Theatre. And I remember at the time thinking, well, first of all, it was quite interesting that he put it like that, because it sort of made it feel naughty but nice, do you know what I mean? A bit of an indulgence. But what was interesting, first of all, it never happened, right? But what was interesting about that was that that sort of statement would never even be made now. All of our cultural institutions have been captured, all our events, such as literary festivals, on the whole, you know what you're going to get. So that is why this is so important to us. We've got great people here, commentators, we've got well-known authors, we've got broadcasters as well over the next couple of days. But most importantly, this will also be, I hope, a kind of how-to advice festival as well, for people who want to be creative and want to write and want to somehow or other break through what has become, I would say, a kind of new glass, or a red-coloured glass ceiling. And I think that's what is important about this festival. So, without further ado, just one thing to say, and that is this would not have been possible without the extraordinary organisation of one man, Philip Kisley here. So, thank you, Philip. Thank you.
Listen, you're going to see an awful lot of me over the next couple of days, so let's see if you're still clapping at the end of tomorrow. Right. Let's press on. I'm actually going to give my own introduction tomorrow, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to introduce our first speaker. Matt Goodwin is a political scientist, writer, and presenter. He is the author of several books, including 2 Sunday Times bestsellers, Values, Voices and Virtue, and National Populism, the latter co-authored with Roger Eatwell. Matt is one of the most persuasive voices in current political commentary. His influence is such that the BBC had to finally stop snubbing him and extend an invite onto Question Time, where he duly wiped the floor. Matt's Substack is a must-read for anyone with any interest in right-leaning political analysis and the political scene more generally. He currently presents a show on GB News and he'll be running across Westminster in about an hour's time to do that. His latest book, Bad Education, which he'll be signing later, deals with the crisis in the British education system. As former professor of politics at the University of Kent, Matt is particularly well-placed to offer some good advice. He's here to talk about bad education, among other things. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome him, Matt Goodwin.
Thank you for the kind word. Appreciate it. Thank you for that. Well, thank you to Philip for the kind, warm welcome. Thank you to the NCF for organising what's an incredibly important event in the national culture, really. I've seen a lot of the literary festivals and the publishers up close, and I can say with absolute certainty this is desperately needed. Seeing as you mentioned question time, I will start by telling a brief story which I think underlines why this festival is needed. A few weeks ago, I happened to be on the show and was making the case against mass uncontrolled immigration, broken borders, woke ideology, and the European Union. And in the green room afterwards, somebody who's fairly well known in this country, may or may not be affiliated with the BBC, came up to me and said, "Matt, it's so good to have your perspective on this show. It's so good to have your views included in this conversation." At which point I thought, well, these are the views of the average man and woman in the country. So, great. And in a way, it underlines a lot of what I talk about in Bad Education, which is the extent to which our public taxpayer-funded institutions have become ideologically captured, are really only catering to the values and the priorities of an elite minority, and which is my biggest concern of all and why I wrote this book, are actually doing a disservice to our young people and the next generation. I started my career in the universities in 2003, and I graduated with my PhD in 2007, and then went to work through a number of different universities in the UK, beginning with the University of Manchester, and then passing through the University of Nottingham, spending some time at the University of Bath, and spending some time at the University of Kent. So I've seen higher education up close. I've seen different institutions in this country up close. And I've seen the evolution of an ideology which, as I set out in this book, is corrupting these institutions. Somebody once said that working in a university is one of the few places in the world where you get older while everyone around you stays the same age. And I always thought about that every September, because a new group of first-year students would arrive on campus, and every year I would find myself feeling just a little bit more depressed at what those students were about to encounter. And I think essentially everything was manageable until, maybe for lots of people in this country, June 2016. And in the book, I describe my career as having two parts, a sort of BB and AB, before Brexit and after Brexit. And prior to Brexit, I basically understood how this system of higher education was working and the incentive structure that was in place and what you needed to do to basically be a successful academic, which mainly involved publishing in top-tier academic journals, attracting research grants, and gradually making your way up the university ladder, which I did. And so by the time that Brexit rolled around, I was already a university professor, so I was able to have some job security. What then unfolded in the weeks and months after the vote for Brexit had a profound impact, not just on me, but I think many of my fellow academic colleagues, when it became really clear the extent to which these universities have become not just political, but I would say hyper-political. And not just the academics, but also the surrounding university bureaucracy. And I'll give you one example of this, which I talk about in the book. A few months after the vote for Brexit, I was actually put in charge of the public speaker program at a university that will remain nameless for the sake of today. I think it would be poor form to embarrass them openly. And I decided that we should invite somebody who had a good grasp as to why people had voted to leave the European Union. And alongside the usual left-leaning academics in that series, I decided it would also be a good idea to invite a public speaker, somebody who had communicated fairly successfully, to the wider public. So I invited somebody, a good friend of mine, and I'm sure you'll know him, called David Goodhart, who throughout his career as editor of Prospect magazine, throughout writing various publications, has a pretty good handle on the divides in British society and why people were beginning to turn to populist movements. When it became apparent that I had invited David onto our public speaker program to come and address our students, a special school meeting was organized. Every member of staff was summoned to attend this meeting from across the UK at considerable expense to the school, because obviously not all academics live and work where the university is. All 30 members of staff were summoned into a room to discuss on a random Wednesday afternoon why a Conservative had been allowed to share their ideas with our students. Now, if you know David, I don't know if he's here, but David is not a Conservative, certainly not in the way that I would consider somebody to be a Conservative. He's a sort of disillusioned social democrat. And a bit like the Blue Labour people. Yeah. And I was quite shocked and embarrassed sitting in that meeting, thinking this is what our students are being exposed to. And the main complaint was that somebody with pro-Brexit views, and I'm not entirely convinced David has pro-Brexit views, had been allowed to discuss his ideas in front of our students without a liberal discussant, without somebody to challenge his views. I thought, wow, this is incredible, given that 75% of the speakers on the program are left-leaning. And I was especially stunned a couple of weeks later when there was another big debate organized on campus about Brexit, involving Gavin Esler, who happened to be our university chancellor, a journalist who had morphed into a strident anti-Brexiteer making a passionate case for a second referendum. And a Labour peer, Andrew Adonis, who, in case you knew Andrew, is a very passionate anti-Brexiteer, at which point I couldn't help myself by saying, well, where's the Conservative discussant in this event and debate? And this was a theme that was running through a lot of the events on campus, which was a glaring ideological imbalance. And it's a symbol, actually, of a deeper problem, which is that if you look at what's happened to universities in this country since the 1960s, basically what's happened is they have moved sharply to the left. In the 1960s, for every one of me, conservative academic, there were 3 academics on the left, according to surveys. So there was a ratio of about 3 to 1. Today, that ratio is 10 to 1, according to reliable surveys. For every 1 conservative academic, there are 10 left-leaning academics. Now, if you go to America, the ratio is absurd in some areas of study. If you look at sociology, if you look at African American studies, women's studies, the ratios can hit 80 to 1. In fact, some of the studies which I summarize in this book say that in some departments there is not a single conservative within those departments. Now you might say, well, what's the problem with that? Do we really need a varied department by politics? Well, the problem is in that monoculture, research becomes highly corrupted. Our students are not exposed to viewpoint diversity, to diversity of thought. Our universities talk endlessly about racial, sexual, and gender diversity. They talk about every form of diversity except diversity of opinion, except diversity of thought. And it contributes to this wider bureaucracy that is embedding a political ideology into higher education. So over the same period, over the last 60, 70 years, we've seen the rapid expansion of the university bureaucracy, whereby the rise of diversity, equity, and inclusion officers, the rise of university bureaucrats, the entrenchment of people whose sole job is to essentially maintain and expand an ideological worldview has become increasingly visible and unavoidable. So much so that the machinery of higher education, to give you just a couple of examples, is now really compromised. If you want to apply for an academic job at any UK university today, you have to submit something called a diversity statement. A A diversity statement is a page of A4 where you, as the potential academic, would explain how your research and teaching contributes to diversity. How do your university modules contribute to diversity? How do your research grants contribute to diversity? If you want to apply for a major research grant at one of the big research councils like the ESRC or the AHRC, you also have to submit a diversity statement. How does this research contribute to diversity? In what way does it support the goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion? So if you're looking at me thinking this is a renegade academic who might be pushing things too far, I would urge you over the weekend to go and look at the major research councils that determine who gets research funding and who doesn't. And the reason that's important as a political litmus test is because it then filters out people who might hold alternative viewpoints from basically getting jobs, being promoted to higher positions, or to obtaining the research grants that you need to be competitive in the academic environment. It's a corruption of what universities are supposed to be about. Universities are supposed to be about the pursuit of truth. They're supposed to be about the pursuit of knowledge. They're supposed to be about the pursuit of science. They are not supposed to be, deep down, even though they began as religious institutions pushing a very different kind of dogma, contemporary universities are supposed to be about putting evidence ahead of ideological dogma. That is no longer happening in almost all of our elite institutions. Reading lists are being decolonized, speaker programs are being monitored, and academic positions are being decided by politics, not by meritocracy and academic excellence and achievement. And you saw that most visibly, I think, in the appointment. Well, you've seen it in a number of things, but you've seen it in the appointment of senior university leaders in America, people like Claudine Gay at Harvard, who should never really have been put in charge of any institution, never mind Harvard, because their academic CV, by all standards, was actually pretty weak. But because they happened to fit the identity characteristics, they were fast-tracked. More worryingly, you've seen it in things like the social justice grievance studies hoax, which my good friend Peter Boghossian, alongside James Lindsley and Helen Pluckrose, oversaw, whereby they deliberately submitted fraudulent papers to academic journals, exposing how corrupt those journals had become, coming up with all kinds of ways to show that so long as you are preaching the fashionable pro-diversity narrative, that you can essentially get any research published in top-tier journals. On one level, it's funny, showing that, dogs interacting in parks can be framed as an expression of white supremacy and what this tells us about our structural racism. But on a serious level, when you're actually watching this as an academic, you're watching your profession be exposed in that way, your vocation be exposed in that way. It's deeply depressing. Another example would be Roland Fryer at Harvard, who a very skilled academic who wanted to publish a paper showing that African Americans were not significantly more likely to be killed by police in America. Yes, they were slightly more likely to experience harassment during the process of arrest, but they were not statistically more likely to be killed by police. And Roland Fryer had a fascinating conversation with the Free Press, a great Substack, where he explained what happened when he was sharing his initial findings. As we do in academics, before they get published, you share the findings with maybe your department at a lunch talk, and you go around to conferences. And he was advised by his colleagues not to publish the paper, not to release it publicly. If he did, they said his career would be over. He had a 30-page appendix attached to that paper when he published it, showing the lengths to which he'd had to go to show that his findings were robust. And of course, when it was published, he was instantly made a pariah because he was challenging the new religion on campus. Of course, here in the UK, the most shocking example of this political intolerance that we've seen was Kathleen Stock, who was essentially chased off campus by trans activists who were enabled by the University of Sussex, by the bureaucracy at the University of Sussex, which, as we now know, had an openly discriminatory policy around trans inclusion. There is some justice that I'll come back to at the end of this talk, but Kathleen was one of dozens of academics in the UK who have been harassed and persecuted, in some cases just sacked, for their political views. Eric Kaufmann was discriminated against at Birkbeck because he was critical of mass immigration. Nigel Biggar was forced to see his research project partners withdraw from a prestigious grant because he challenged the narrative that Britain's empire was simply a story of slavery and exploitation. So the political imbalance has been very obvious, I think, for some time. And for me, what was especially depressing was the impact that it was having on the people who matter the most, which is our students, and becoming aware of the extent to which they were changing their behavior in response to this politicization of higher education. I always encountered this the second or third week into the semester when I used to teach a third year undergraduate module, where in weeks 2 or 3, a group of students would always approach me and say something along the lines of, I've really been looking forward to taking this module because until now, I feel as though I've just had a very left-wing view of politics, culture, and society until this point. But if you look at the national surveys are pretty damning. About 1 in 4 university students, according to King's, a study with Ipsos Mori, are self-censoring in their seminars and lectures because they don't want to voice opinions that might challenge those of their lecturers and university professors. But even more depressing than that, for me, was what students were telling me about how they were gaming the system, knowing the reality of the politics in university. I had a student once explain to me how they would present a liberal progressive worldview even though they didn't believe it because they felt that's what their university professor wanted them to express, which was really a very depressing moment in my academic career. Not to mention the sheer hypocrisy of having to watch universities really punish some of my friends while engaging in very questionable behavior. A good friend of, a colleague, Tony Sewell, who you might remember wrote a very influential government report on racial disparities in this country. Once again, Tony Sewell challenged the established narrative among the elite class, saying, look, I'm sorry, but different outcomes among different groups is not simply because of institutional racism. We need to consider other variables like family breakdown, economic deprivation, local cultures, and so on and so on. And Tony had, before publishing that report, had been offered an honorary doctorate by the university that I was at, the University of Nottingham. A great university, really, Russell Group University, very prestigious, and Tony had accepted this award. And when his report came out with the government, the University of Nottingham rescinded his offer, the offer of an honorary doctorate, at the very same time as Nottingham were giving honorary doctorates to members of the Chinese Communist Party because they had overseas campuses in China and giving honorary doctorates to corrupt politicians in Malaysia where they had an overseas campus as well. These are just a few examples that led me to the point in really, I think, during the COVID pandemic, where, you know, I think we've all had this moment in life. You kind of reach a point and you think, do I really want to spend the rest of my life doing what I'm doing? You know, the lucky ones who maybe have been in love with everything they've been doing all along, I'm sort of envious, but actually you kind of, over time, it just gradually wears you down. You think, God, if I don't change this, I'm going to be that guy over there who's been in the universities and, you know, he's in his early 70s and this is it. And over time, it just wore me down. But I thought, well, I'm not going to leave without trying to do something. And the last chapter of the book is really about what that thing is, which was working with a lot of the people I've just mentioned to design and deliver the Higher Education Free Speech Act, which is the only piece of legislation in Europe, prior to Trump 2, was the only piece of legislation, I think, in the Western world that is explicitly designed to protect and promote free speech on the university campus. And for lots of people, the idea of using the state to intervene in universities makes them feel uncomfortable. When you've worked in the universities, you realize these institutions are never going to reform themselves. They have absolutely no desire to reform themselves. And so what we did with this bill is we created a structure whereby if universities openly flout free speech and free expression, they can be fined. And the one thing universities understand is money. That's why they don't want international student numbers to go down. And so we decided that if we could create a mechanism whereby universities can be punished financially if they violate free speech and free expression, that might actually begin to create culture change. I explained to Boris Johnson the importance of this, and actually credit to Johnson, he put it in the Conservative Party manifesto in 2019. It was then taken up by the Conservative Party, and in fairness to Rishi Sunak, it was the Conservative Party under Rishi Sunak who got the bill through, and it was then passed. Now, when Labour came to office last July, Bridget Phillipson, initially the Labour Education Secretary, did everything she could to try and stop this bill becoming law, to basically try and dilute it, to try and suppress it. And thankfully, because of the work of the Free Speech Union, I mean, it's amazing actually, when you look at this room, how many people connected to this network have actually got things done. The Free Speech Union, who then threatened to, and in fact did take the Labour government to court to ensure that they passed that, they maintained that law and they kept it in place, even though Keir Starmer and Bridget Phillipson did everything they could to get rid of it. Well, that story culminated in the delightful headline recently of the University of Sussex being fined £600,000 for its treatment of Kathleen Stock. And I can guarantee that the University of Sussex, and indeed every Vice-Chancellor in this country that watched that story, and every university, will not be violating free speech, free expression, and the right of academics to express gender-critical views, conservative views, non-conformist views in a way that they once did. So that was my see you later moment to the universities. And the book, I decided, well, I better write it all down because somewhere out there might be some young academics and students who actually do care about what's happening to our universities and do care about the things that I think everyone in this room cares about, which is the things that made these islands so great to begin with: free speech, free expression, individual liberty. And I hope you check it out, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope to not see you on campus sometime soon. But thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Matt, for that brilliant speech. We have a roving microphone, I think. Where is Ellie? Is she around? Oh, it's Kurt. Hello, Kurt. Just to build on that very, very quickly, all of the comments there about the craziness of academia really hit home with me. I remember, I'm thinking about 2018, my research, I was interested in television and aesthetic. And I submitted a peer-reviewed article to a journal. And the peer review came back quite positively, but it said it would be good if you could include some LGBTQI plus narrative in this. The article was about the television program The Sweeney. Go figure. Right, can we have some hands up for questions, please, for Matt? Gentleman here in the middle.
First of all, to say, Matt, thank you for fighting the good fight. I got out of the higher education sector the lazy man's way by retiring. So I won't name my institution because I'm currently Professor Emeritus. My head of school had to go through the hassle of getting me that. And it would be a bit unfair to me if I got it taken away again. But suffice to say, it was a Russell Group university. I'm in engineering, not the natural social battleground you might think. But the curiosity is that you fight the same battles. For example, the Engineering Council, which governs the universe of chartered engineers and its engineering education, insists that we assess students on ED&I. Not merely teach it, but assess it. And so it goes on. And my question is, given that there is now what appears to be a fairly robust free speech law, are there ways of stopping the higher education monolith from subverting this? Because I am naturally suspicious that that's what will happen. Maybe I'm just a paranoid old fart, but that does worry me a bit. Thank you.
We all?
Well, the Labour government gave it a good go. They really did everything they could to overturn, dilute, and defang the higher education bill without any question. Now, they failed. And I think, if Keir Starmer and Bridget Phillipson weren't able to do it, I'm sceptical that others will be able to. So far, the sector seems to be playing ball. But I think there are other things we could be doing. So I've been won over by the argument that actually, and this is partly what the NCF is about, and I said to Peter, when he emailed about speaking, I said instantly I'd do it, because I think one of the really important things everybody needs to do at the moment is contribute to building alternative institutions and a wider ecosystem. And since leaving my University of Kent, even though I still have a sort of loose affiliation there, I joined Eric Kaufman and his centre at the University of Buckingham, the Heterodox Social Science Centre, which has been set up to teach about things you wouldn't normally get at Oxbridge. I mean, I'll give you an example. I reviewed a handbook about a year ago on left-wing extremism, right? And it starts with the sentence by the author, who let's just say is on side, but he says, this is the first published academic handbook on left-wing extremism, right, in the 2020s. Now, look how much academic work is done on right-wing extremism, or et cetera, et cetera. So Eric has decided that he's now launching the first online modules to study radical progressivism, woke ideology, to look at things that the universities are not looking at. You can take these in your spare time if you want. You don't have to contribute towards a degree. Jordan Peterson started the Peterson Academy. We've got the University of Texas at Austin. We've got Ralston College. Could go on and on. So this alternative ecosystem is emerging. Now, if some of that becomes quite successful, again, it's another reason that the legacy universities and the vice-chancellors will take notice of that. The more of these free speech cases that are won, like the one at Sussex, which was incredible to see Sussex be fined 600,000. It was great, it was fantastic. The more of that stuff that happens, the more the universities will sit up and pay attention, and the more students actually say, look, I'm not paying the best part of 30, 40, 50,000 pounds. My family is not paying the best part of this money to have a politically biased education. And the more that students speak up about this, actually, I think is really important too. I'm fairly optimistic. I'm sure Lionel may come on later and say she's pessimistic about the future of travel, the direction of travel. I don't know, but for the first time in a long time, I'm actually optimistic. Let's not turn this into a discussion about politics, but we have also going on in this country a historic political change in the polls, led by a party that is unequivocally committed to free speech, free expression, and individual liberty. Okay, so there are other pressures that are now bearing down on the sector. Yeah, and I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic.
Okay, have we got any more questions, please? Can you put your hands up? And can you keep them brief and to the point as well? This gentleman here on the 4th row. Yep.
Hi, so returning to the theme about reform versus replacement, not reform the party, but reform the
Sorry, we
institutions.
can't hear you. I think you need to speak into it.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, a little bit better, yeah.
Yeah. So, on the theme of reform in the institutions versus alternative for the institutions, I mean, I think I have a more pessimistic view than the panel about this because, I mean, I used to be at Russell Group University, and partly this political element that's happened with woke ideology, or however you might phrase it, that supervenes on a hollowing out of the academy that already happened. So you have academic institutions that have tight citation rings and distribute research funding, or who gets a postdoc or who gets a tenure based upon the sociology of the department rather than the first order principle of, say, knowledge production. And so why I'm pessimistic about this is that they might legally stay within the guardrails for the purpose of not getting a fine, but they still elite self-recruit people who think like them. And so if you don't have academics who think differently, even though they're free to speak, they don't organically say anything different because they all think the same anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. It's this system of higher education is always going to be skewed. That's the reality of it. But you can do things that make a real difference, like fining institutions if there are open violations, reforming the research councils, scrapping diversity statements, introducing measures that take account of political diversity when hiring academics, not just racial, sexual, gender diversity. There are things that you could potentially do that would help to level, make the scales a little bit more balanced, okay? So I'm just not one anymore for holding my hands up and saying, well, it's over, we can't really change things. And also look at what's happening in the US. I don't agree with everything Donald Trump is doing, just have to insert that usual caveat. But what he is doing in terms of some of the universities, in terms of reforming and rooting out DEI, which is a racist, politically motivated agenda, that's exactly what it is. Diversity is celebrating every form of diversity except diversity of thought. Equality is forcing equal outcomes by discriminating against white people. And inclusion is including every perspective except those that actually challenge the dominant orthodoxy on campus. It's a ridiculous agenda, and I do actually agree with what Trump and Vance and Chris Rufo and others have been doing in trying to counter DEI. And I think we should be taking some of that, learning some of those lessons and applying them here in the UK. I think higher education could really be reformed quite radically along those lines. And the other thing is, if there are donors in the room, people keep saying to me, I always run up against donors who say, well, I think we should buy, we should get an Oxford or Cambridge college and we should create, our own microsystem within one of these universities. And I'm always of the view that, why would you do that? Because the first thing that they'll do is tie you up in ethics. They'll tie you up in the ethics committee. They'll make it impossible for you to bring about real change. Why not actually invest that money in supporting one of these alternative institutions that can really make a difference at trying to fight back? I think we also need alternative academic publishers. I know that Matthew Hamilton's speaking tomorrow. I think the publishing industry in academia is completely screwed. I used to have to publish in a book series that was literally led by somebody who was a member of Antifa. It's crazy when you actually look at the level of political bias that goes on in academic publishing. It's insane. So the publishing model also needs looked at, but also the grants, the research councils, because they determine who gets the money. And you don't get promoted now unless you have the money. And if you are making that exercise an openly political one, then that is how they're filtering through the academics. So I think there are things you can do, but You have to just be realistic about the system.
I think so, and I think one of the things as well Matt said before, I think one of the truest things that universities really know about money, and arts, humanities and social sciences are just dying on the branch. Students are not taking these degrees anymore because they don't actually learn anything, they just learn to hate themselves. So there's something there, there's an economic imperative there which I think will be very useful to us. Are there any more questions, please? Oh, lots. The gentleman at the back there, with the dark top on.
Good evening, Matt. Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you for everything that you do. My question relates to the statements you were making about the great imbalance in the education system of left-wing to right-wing people. And it's simply this: how and why has that occurred? And just a couple of extra thoughts quickly. It's probably not only in education. From what one hears publicly, you might say similar things happen in the civil service.
Yeah.
And one other just random thought to put in there. Many years ago, there was I think he was a KGB defector called Yuri Bezmenov, who spoke about the methods that he himself and others used to promote their cause. And one of them was subversion. And one of the key things in that was you start by subverting a nation's youth. So as an extra question, is it possible that there's been a concerted effort from some quarter to actually subvert the nation's youth? Thank you.
Well, in terms of the first question, I think it's happened through a combination of self-selection, liberal, left-leaning people self-selecting into the universities, those universities becoming a deeply inhospitable place for conservative and gender-critical scholars. I mean, be honest with you, like, it's not nice to work in universities if you do not share the dominant views in those universities. It's just not a pleasant experience. Everything that you encounter, from walking onto campus, the symbolism of campus, the statues that are on campus, the paraphernalia that's on campus, through to what the research seminars are about, knowing that the vast majority of colleagues are gradually isolating you or removing you from influential positions. I mean, it is a deeply depressing, isolating experience if you are a non-conformist. And Kathleen Stock has written very eloquently about her experience. Eric Kaufman has written about his. I mean, it's pretty grim. And so if you are a talented, conservative, gender-critical, whatever, like, why would you devote your life to the universities? You'd go off and you'd do something else. You'd join some other sector. And I think through that process, there's always been a left-wing bias in the universities, but it has become much, much more pronounced. Some of that clearly has been deliberate. There has been an activist radical minority that have viewed the institutions as being places that they want to try and cultivate ideologies and socialization in a way that advances their ideas. Of course, that's always been the case. But in my experience, I think more important in a way is just the blob that surrounds the radical activists. It is the ethics committees, it's the research councils, it's the human resource departments, it's the DEI officers, it's the school secretaries, it's all the little obstacles that you have to overcome. Like, if I wanted to study, I don't know, let's think about, the impact of the small boat crossings on criminality in the UK. Let's take that as an example. I've got to get that as a research question. I've got to get that through an ethics committee in my department, maybe elevated to a university ethics committee. I've got to get research funding, which means I've got to apply for a research council, and my application is going to be reviewed by 3 other academics, the vast majority of whom will not be predisposed to supporting that research. If I then manage to get the research in place and I manage to explore that question, I've then got to show some kind of outcome for it, which means I've got to write a paper. I've got to get that through peer review. Again, that paper is going to be reviewed by 2 or 3 other academics, if indeed the editor of that journal decides that they want to publish that. And if I can't get that into a fairly prestigious academic journal and it ends up in what we might call a low-tier journal, well, that's not going to do very well for my career. That's probably not going to help next time I want to get promoted. So you look at this and you think, well, maybe I shouldn't look at the impact of the small boat crossings on criminality. Maybe I should look at, I don't know, the spread of woke ideas among young left-leaning women, because that seems really fashionable among my university department. And the pathway to becoming a successful academic is going to be a lot easier if I just lean into the groupthink instead of openly challenging the groupthink. And so over time, the incentive structure just kind of kicks in. And you think, well, okay, if I want to become professor, and I was very ambitious early on in my career, I thought, yeah, I'll lean into the groupthink a bit and we'll just do that. And of course, what you're violating and you're compromising on is your integrity, is your intellectual honesty. And so you find yourself over time entering into this very strange environment where you don't really feel, I didn't feel at least, that I was being consistent with my intellectual principles. And in that way, the incentive structure, I think, is really quite powerful. And Jordan Peterson, James Orr, they've all talked about the same thing, which is being aware that you are in a deeply hostile environment, and it takes something special to live in that every day, to not let it change your character. And for some people, to spend decades in it.
It's incredibly sad, actually, to spend decades living a lie, and you're producing research which is supposed to be the truth. I'd just add to that, if it's very depressing to be in that situation, and it's very hostile. It gets a hell of a lot more hostile when you have a public profile.
If I just briefly, there's one example. If you don't know this, it's in the book, but it's just interesting. There was a very young, talented graduate student called Michael Lacour, who a few years ago published a draft working paper in which he claimed to show that Americans who have a face-to-face conversation with a gay canvasser knocking on their door become much more supportive of same-sex marriage. And he claimed to have conducted a field experiment which showed this. Now, of course, this is music to the ears of social liberals. Well, contact theory, we just need to go and knock on doors and everybody will become super supportive of same-sex marriage, and it's just basically the idiots in the flyover states who haven't yet encountered the wonders of of same-sex marriage, and therefore this is great, we just need to do that. The paper was published, top-tier journal, was featured in Science, Nature. I mean, these are the top-level places, and Michael Lacour was identified as having an incredible academic career ahead of him. I think he even got a job at Princeton, and his PhD supervisors were obviously, held in high esteem and added to their reputation, until a fellow graduate student got hold of the data and realized that he had made the whole thing up and published this blog and said, look, and okay, I think they were rivals, so, this fellow graduate student was obviously trying to, but understandably was doing the data integrity work, published this blog, embarrassed Michael Lacour, but more fundamentally revealed how corrupt the system is. Because here's a paper that chimes with the groupthink. Why did his PhD supervisors not pick this up? Why had they not checked the data? Why had the academic journals not checked the data? Why had the journalists who had written about the article, why had they not actually checked things out? And that is one story that we happen to know about. There will be dozens and dozens of articles and stories that we don't know about, where the findings happen to support the dominant orthodoxy. Now, of course, his career after that was in ruins. His PhD supervisors had to issue a statement and say how embarrassed they were by this whole affair. But to me as well, at the time I was fairly junior, that again was another eye-opening moment of just how corrupt is this system, is the publishing system, and is the academic conference system, where you go to very lovely locations around the world and you present your papers and everyone nods and says, well, how wonderful this is, this confirms everything that we've thought. Yet it didn't exist. It was made up. And that, I think, for institutions that are invested in knowledge, science, and truth, that is really quite devastating.
It is, and in many of the peer-reviewed journals as well, there are articles that are just never, ever read. Okay? We're paying for that. Matthew Goodwin, thank you very much indeed.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture, and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programs, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.